Good evening, and welcome. Tonight, as the world outside drifts into quiet, we'll travel back to a moment in history when even time seemed to lose its voice. A night when the ticking of clocks faded and the world slowed down until it almost stopped. So, settle in. Imagine the soft crackle of a fire nearby, the warmth of its glow brushing against your face, and the slow rhythm of your own breath. This story isn't here to wake your mind. It's here to let it rest, to let curiosity feel like comfort, and to let history carry you gently toward sleep. Where are you listening from tonight? What hour has found you? Perhaps the moon is high above your window, or maybe dawn is waiting just beyond the horizon. Before we wander further into this story, if you enjoy quiet tales like this, you can gently press the like and subscribe button. Not now, maybe later, when you've already drifted off. There was a time, long ago, when the world didn't hum with engines or digital lights. The rhythm of life was measured by footsteps, by wind, by the turning of the earth itself. But in the middle of the 14th century, that rhythm broke. A sickness swept across towns and valleys, and for the first time, humanity felt what it meant for time to slow to truly stop. The sound of markets faded first. Then came the silence of workshops, once filled with the steady clang of metal and the laughter of workers. In the cities, the tall clock towers stood proudly against the sky, but their bells rang for fewer reasons. The hours that once ruled people's lives began to lose meaning. Imagine walking through one of those streets. The air feels still, heavy with dust and quiet. The shop doors are shut, their signs swaying softly in the wind. Somewhere in the distance, a lonely clock ticks, its echo traveling farther than it ever had before. The world has become a hollow shell of sound. And in that stillness, people began to sense something they had never felt before. Time itself felt tired. The days stretched endlessly, and the nights seemed to arrive without warning. With each sunrise, there was no sense of progress, no reason to mark the hour. The only rhythm that mattered was the slow beat of survival. If you're still awake, take a deep breath. Feel how the air moves in and out of your chest, steady and calm. You are safe here, listening to the echoes of a forgotten moment. The story continues quietly, like a whisper through the corridors of time, in the countryside, where the air was cleaner and the fields wider. People whispered about the silence spreading across the land. Some said it was as if the world had taken a deep breath and refused to exhale. The stillness became a kind of mirror, showing people not what they were doing, but what they had become. Days melted into each other. Without the bells or the work or the chatter of daily life, the sun and moon became the only clocks people could trust. And yet, even they seemed slower. The light lingered longer in the sky, and shadows stretched far beyond their usual reach, as though time had loosened its grip. Sometimes, at night, those who were still awake swore they could hear it, the faint hum of the world turning. It was slower, yes, but still moving. Beneath the fear, beneath the silence, life was quietly waiting. Waiting for the moment when time would begin again. If your eyes are growing heavy, let them. Let the sound of this story blend with your breathing, slow and easy. The world once paused, and so can you. In the heart of once crowded cities, clock towers stood frozen. Their hands, halted at random hours, looked down upon empty streets. Dust gathered on their faces, and pigeons made quiet homes where bells had once sung. The sound that once measured every heartbeat of the city was gone. People began to wonder if time itself had fallen, if it too had caught the stillness that crept through every doorway. Farmers no longer rose with the same urgency. The roosters crowed, but no one counted the hours between dawn and dusk. The sky became their only measure, a slow shifting canvas of gold and grey. Some said they could feel the day growing longer, stretching endlessly, as if the world had forgotten how to turn. If you're still listening, let this quiet linger. Let it wash over you like the soft rhythm of wind brushing through tall grass. You're not in a hurry. Neither was the world back then. Travelers passing through the countryside told of abandoned roads and silent inns. They said the world felt as though it were holding its breath. Even the rivers seemed slower, their currents softened. The familiar ticking of life, the sound of wheels turning hooves, striking stone, doors opening and closing, had all faded into the same hush. In small cottages, families gathered around dim fires, their faces lit by the soft flicker of flame. They spoke in low voices, not to disturb the fragile quiet outside. Each spark from the fire felt like a heartbeat, steady and rare. They didn't talk about time anymore, only moments, simple ones, like warmth, safety, and the hope that tomorrow would come. Far away, the sky turned a dull grey that lasted for weeks. The sun, once a steady guide, seemed uncertain behind the haze. Morning and evening blurred into the same muted glow. People began to lose track of the days. Some even stopped marking them, saying, "Why count what no longer moves?" Every so often, a clock would still chime, a stubborn reminder of what once was. Its echo stretched across the emptiness, bouncing from stone to stone, before fading into nothing. The sound didn't comfort anyone. It reminded them that time was still somewhere, waiting, patient and distant. If you find yourself drifting, let it happen. Let the stillness of this story become the blanket that covers your thoughts. There's no need to chase the end. History, like sleep, will find you on its own. As the weeks passed, the silence became almost normal. People learned to live without counting. They rose when they were rested, ate when they were hungry, and slept when darkness returned. For the first time in generations, humanity lived by the rhythm of nature, alone, slower, quieter, but still alive. And there, in that unmeasured silence, the world discovered something strange and beautiful. Time had not vanished. Stet had simply gone to rest, waiting for humankind to remember how to listen. The clocks would one day start again, but for now, everything was still. And in that stillness, the world, for just a moment, felt at peace. Before the world had slowed, time had ruled everything. The clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the toll of the bell in the town square, the soft steps of traders setting up their stalls all moved to the rhythm of the clock. Hours meant order, and order meant life. But when the plague spread, that rhythm faltered. The bells rang less often, the hammers fell silent, and the world seemed to slip out of sync with time itself. In the great cities, people once gathered beneath tall towers to hear the bells mark the hour. It was comforting, a promise that life was still moving forward. But now, those same towers stood silent, their great gears unwound, their ropes slack. The stillness that once lasted a moment now lasted days. Even the echoes felt tired. Time no longer guided people's days. It simply drifted. The marketplace that had once filled every morning with color and noise was now a grey, empty square. Dust coated the stalls, and a single feather danced lazily in the wind. The sun rose and fell, but no one watched it. The rhythm of life had dissolved into one long pause. If you listen closely in your imagination, you might hear the faint creak of a door somewhere, or the sigh of the wind brushing past broken shutters. Those were the only sounds that marked the passing of time now. Each gust of air felt heavier, like the breath of a world unsure whether to keep going. In homes where families still lingered, people no longer spoke about tomorrow. Instead, they spoke in hours that felt like days, and days that felt like weeks. The old words, morning, noon, evening, lost their meaning. They measured time not by clocks anymore, but by emotion. Hope felt like daylight. Fear felt like dusk. Even the animals seemed to notice. Horses stood still for hours, their ears twitching to sounds that never came. Birds stopped singing at dawn, unsure of what the day would bring. The world felt suspended between two moments, like the pause between heartbeats, when everything is waiting for what comes next. If your breathing has slowed by now, let it. You're matching the rhythm of this story, the same rhythm the world once kept when it forgot how to count the hours. In the absence of time, people discovered strange new habits. Some would sit outside for hours, watching the same leaf sway in the same wind. Others stared at the slow movement of clouds, convinced they were hardly moving at all. Days blurred together until even memory began to lose its shape. Yet, amid all that stillness, there was something oddly gentle about the world. With no bells, no schedules, and no rushing, the silence began to feel less like fear and more like rest, as if the earth itself had chosen to sleep for a while, waiting to heal. And though no one dared to say it aloud, deep inside, many began to wonder, if time could stop for so long, would it ever begin again? In some towns, the few who still wound their clocks began to lose count. The gears turned, but the meaning behind them was gone. They said the hours were empty now, like shells washed ashore after a storm. Each tick sounded softer than before, swallowed by the silence that filled every room. Those who had once lived by the clock began to drift into a different rhythm. They woke when the light touched their windows, and rested when the darkness returned. The world, without knowing it, had gone back to a rhythm as old as creation itself. One not built on bells or calendars, but on breath, warmth, and the steady turning of the earth. If you can feel your own heartbeat now, let it slow a little more. That's the only rhythm that ever mattered, even when the world forgot the rest. The streets that once overflowed with laughter and trade were now quiet enough to hear the wind's low hum. A cartwheel creaked in the distance, abandoned mid-journey. The smell of dust and rain lingered in the air, and every now and then someone would stop, listening, wondering if the silence itself was trying to speak. A few chroniclers, those who still wrote by candlelight, recorded what they saw. Not battles or rulers, but the feeling of the days. One wrote, "The world no longer moves by hours, but by shadows." It wasn't poetry, it was observation. The slow fading of light had become the only way to know the day's passing. At night, the stars shone brighter, unchallenged by the glow of lamps or the movement of people. Some found peace in that stillness, saying the sky had never looked so vast. Time, in its stillness, had given them something unexpected, space to look up again. If your thoughts begin to wander, let them drift like those stars. They don't need direction, just space. Weeks passed like that, so quiet, so unmeasured that people began to lose fear of the silence. The pause became familiar, even comforting. Without the constant pull of time, there was nowhere to be, nothing to chase, only moments, simple and soft, one after another. And in that stillness, the smallest things began to matter again. The sound of bread crackling near the fire, the warmth of sunlight through a window, the feeling of waking without hurry. It was as though the world was learning to breathe again. No one knew when the clocks would start turning once more. But as the silence stretched on, a strange truth settled over them. Life had never really stopped, it had only changed its pace. Time had stepped aside, giving space for something gentler to take its place. And so the world waited, quietly, without rush or measure, in that invisible pause where every heartbeat, every whisper, became its own kind of time. The quiet could not last forever. Even silence, as deep as it was, began to tremble under the weight of time returning. The world, once caught in stillness, started to stir again slowly, like a dreamer waking from a heavy sleep. But when life began to move, it did not return the same. Something in the air had changed, something restless and uneasy, as if the earth itself remembered the stillness and feared the noise that would follow. The first signs were small: a cart creaking down a lonely road, a hammer striking metal in a half-ruined workshop, the faint laughter of a child chasing a stray cat through an empty square. They were sounds of life, yes, but fragile, uncertain, like the first ripples on a pond after a long winter. Those who survived the pause looked different now. They carried the weight of the silence in their eyes. Some smiled at the sound of work returning, while others flinched, as if afraid the world might wake too fast. They had lived inside a storm of quiet, and even peace had felt dangerous. In towns that once thrived with trade, people reopened their shutters. The light fell across empty tables and worn floors, revealing how much had been lost. The clock towers, once frozen, began to stir. Some were repaired by trembling hands, old gears turning again after months of dust. The sound was not triumphant. It was hesitant, almost shy. If you're still awake, notice how even your breath finds a rhythm again. The story, like the world it tells, is beginning to move forward once more. But the rhythm that returned was not gentle. It came with hunger and grief and the fierce need to rebuild. Crops had died in the fields, tools had rusted, and trade routes had broken. The survivors, thin and weary, began to work again, not out of joy, but out of need. Every swing of a scythe, every strike of a hammer, sounded like a plea for normalcy. The silence had ended, but it left behind a strange echoer, fear that time might stop again. Even as the bells rang once more, their chime sounded different. It was sharper, emptier, as though it remembered the months it had slept. In that uneasy return, people noticed the sky more than before. The sunsets were redder, the air colder. Nature had not waited for humanity. It had continued on, quietly reshaping the world. Forests crept closer to the edges of towns, rivers changed their course, and birds nested in the rafters of abandoned halls. Some said the earth had taken back what people once ruled. Others simply nodded, too tired to argue. The world had survived, yes, but it no longer belonged entirely to them. It was as though humanity had to earn its place again, under skies that watched in silence. If your eyelids grow heavy now, let them. The storm that's rising isn't loud yet. It begins softly, like a whisper under the breath of time, reminding the world that silence and sound were never enemies, only partners in the rhythm of existence. And as the days grew longer again, so too did the shadows. Something was stirring beneath the relief. The stillness had passed, but what followed carried its own kind of weight. The rise of movement, of rebuilding, of power, and the quiet price that always comes with it. In the towns that began to breathe again, the hum of life returned slowly, like an old melody remembered note by note. The ringing of hammers, the low murmur of voices, and the distant tolling of bells stitched the fabric of time back together. Yet, under that rhythm, Something uneasy lingered, an invisible reminder of how fragile it all was. Merchants came back to the squares, spreading worn cloths over wooden tables. Farmers returned to their fields, turning soil that had grown cold and strange. It was a season of cautious hope, but hope, like any fragile thing, can tremble easily. People smiled again, though their eyes darted often to the horizon, as if watching for something they couldn't quite name. If you're still awake, take a slow breath. Feel the quiet balance between calm and tension, the space where both can exist together. That's where history often lives in. The pause before something changes. The rulers and officials, those who had hidden through the worst of the silence, began to step forward once more. They spoke of rebuilding, of structure, of order. But their words carried a new tone, one shaped by fear of losing control again. Some said they wanted to protect the people. Others whispered they only wanted to protect time itself. In narrow alleys and dim inns, travelers traded stories of places where the silence still lingered, villages untouched by trade, valleys where the bells had not yet rung again. It was said those places felt timeless, trapped in the pause. People spoke of them softly, as if mentioning them too loudly might bring the stillness back. The air was changing. Wind moved differently across the fields, carrying the scent of earth and smoke. Each sunrise felt like a test, as if the world was asking whether it could trust humanity again. And though the clocks had begun to tick once more, some claimed they ran slower, as if time itself was hesitant to forgive. If your breathing has softened, stay with that rhythm. It's the same rhythm the world found after the storm of silence, steady, uncertain, but alive. Artists and thinkers began to speak of the silence as something sacred. They said it had taught the world humility, that it reminded people of their smallness beneath the vast sky. Others disagreed, saying it had stolen too much. The arguments never grew loud. Even words seemed gentler after so much stillness. And yet, beneath that quiet civility, a new energy was forming. The desire to rebuild had turned into ambition. Cities grew again, stronger and louder. The bells rang not just for hours now, but for power, for wealth, for pride. The same ticking that once comforted people began to sound like a challenge, faster, sharper, demanding more. The storm had returned, not in the form of silence this time, but in movement. It was the storm of progress, beautiful, inevitable, and dangerous in its own way. The world had learned to move again, but it had also forgotten the peace of stillness. And as night settled once more, a quiet truth lingered in the air. When the clocks began to turn again, so did the restlessness of humankind. The silence had passed, but its echo, soft, haunting, eternal in memory, would never truly fade. The sound of life had returned, but with it came whispers. The world that had once been united in silence now found itself divided by questions. Who had survived? Who had gained from the stillness? Some began to look at their neighbors differently, measuring every glance, every word, as though secrets hid behind familiar eyes. The peace that followed the storm was not built on trust, it was built on uncertainty. In small gatherings, people spoke in hushed tones. They wondered why some towns recovered faster than others, or how a few merchants had grown rich, while so many had nothing left. Rumors spread like frost across rooftops. It wasn't just about sickness anymore, it was about blame. And blame, once awakened, moves faster than fear ever could. If you can feel the air around you soften, breathe it in slowly. Suspicion moves quietly, and it always begins this way, with whispers that never seem to fade. In cities once filled with trade, those who had survived the worst began to rebuild walls, not just of stone, but of distance. Markets reopened, but eyes no longer met easily. People nodded politely, but their hands lingered protectively over their goods. The silence that once covered the land had changed form. It now lived between people. Officials tried to restore order. They sent messengers to reassure the public that life was safe again. But their words carried little weight. People had learned during the long stillness to listen less to voices of power and more to the unease within their own hearts. It was a quiet rebellion, unspoken, but spreading. If you're still awake, notice the rhythm of this moment. Calm on the surface, but with a pulse beneath it. History often moves like this, softly at first, before the sound begins to rise. In the countryside, where time moved more gently, farmers began to distrust travelers. A single cough could make an entire village fall silent. Doors closed faster. Conversations ended sooner. The stillness of the plague had left behind invisible scars. People had learned how fragile life could be, and now they guarded it with suspicion. Some chroniclers wrote that the silence of the clocks had been replaced by a silence of hearts. It wasn't emptiness anymore, it was distance. Each person lived in their own small world, cautious, watchful, unwilling to reach too far. Humanity had survived together, but was learning to live apart. The winds that once carried songs and laughter now carried rumors. Tales of vanished families, of stolen food, of strangers who brought misfortune. None were confirmed, but each one took root. Fear, when wrapped in mystery, becomes something that no bell can chase away. If your breathing has slowed again, let it stay that way. The story drifts softly, even when shadows begin to stretch. What you're hearing is not the noise of chaos, but the sound of people trying to protect what little peace they still remember. And so, beneath the surface of recovery, another kind of storm began to form, not made of silence or sickness this time, but of suspicion. And like all storms, it started quietly, before anyone could name what it truly was. In the dim corners of taverns and town squares, quiet conversations began to twist. Someone would mention a name, and another would nod too quickly. Trust became rare, more precious than gold, more fragile than glass. People no longer feared the sickness itself. They feared what others might do when no one was watching. The world had survived the stillness, but not its memory. Those who had once been healers or caretakers were now looked at with unease. How did they stay well when others did not? Some whispered, "What did they know that we didn't?" It didn't matter that most had simply been lucky. In the shadow of fear, reason moved slower than rumor. If you're still awake, take a breath and let it go. Even suspicion, heavy as it feels, can fade if you breathe slowly enough. In villages surrounded by endless fields, travelers were no longer welcomed. A knock at the door brought silence instead of greeting. People who had once offered bread to strangers now hid it beneath their tables. The world had learned caution, and it wore that lesson like a second skin. The markets that had once echoed with laughter now filled with quiet calculation. Every exchange came with a glance, a silent question. Even the coins seemed colder, passing between hands that no longer trusted each other. The weight of survival had turned companionship into careful distance. Officials tried to restore a sense of unity, but the tone of their decrees grew sharper. Rules multiplied. Restrictions tightened. Some said it was for safety. Others whispered it was for control. The very structure that once protected people now felt like another kind of trap. If your thoughts are drifting, let them. The story slows again here, resting in the space between words. Like the silence between heartbeats, it's gentle, but uneasy. In the countryside, Isolation deepened. People who once gathered for harvest festivals now stayed home. Music, once a sign of joy, became a rare sound. Even the birds seemed quieter, as if they too were cautious of being heard. A few scholars later wrote that this was the true legacy of the plague, not the loss of lives, but the loss of trust. It was as if humanity had learned to fear connection itself, mistaking solitude for safety. And in that distance, time once again began to slow. If your eyes are heavy, let them close. The story is still moving, but softly now, like footsteps fading down an empty road. The clocks had started again, but their ticking felt hollow, as if they counted not hours, but the space between people. Suspicion lingered like a fog that refused to lift. The world was awake again, yet somehow still half asleep. And somewhere beneath that quiet unease, history waited, knowing that after every silence, after every storm of mistrust, something else always begins to stir. The silence of suspicion had settled deep into the bones of cities and villages alike. But beneath that stillness, something heavier began to take shape, a quiet dread that no one could name, yet everyone could feel. It was not the same fear that came with the plague, nor the chaos that followed it. This was slower, colder, like mist creeping in before dawn. The air seemed thicker, the light dimmer. People spoke less, moved slower, and looked at one another as though waiting for a storm they couldn't see. Life had resumed, yes, but it carried the weight of something unfinished, like a story that refused to end. Even the clock towers, once proud symbols of rhythm and order, now seemed tired. Their bells rang faintly through the fog, each chime echoing with a strange emptiness. Time had returned, but it no longer comforted. It felt mechanical, distant, almost hollow. The ticking that once marked life's progress now served as a reminder of everything that had been lost. Farmers worked their fields with downcast eyes. Merchants set up their stalls without laughter. The familiar rhythm of trade and toil continued, but no one truly believed in it anymore. The world was breathing, but shallowly, like someone afraid to wake the silence that still lingered in its memory. If you're still awake, listen to the rhythm of your breath. The world you're hearing now once moved at the same pace, steady, uncertain, yet alive. Beneath the surface calm, it waited for something to change, and that waiting was its own kind of storm. In the great cities, where cobblestone streets wound through narrow lanes, people began to feel watched, not by one another, but by the weight of history itself. The years of stillness had left a mark too deep to fade. It lived in the architecture, in the air, in the way sound carried through the walls. Even laughter felt strange now, as though it didn't belong in the new world time had built. Some said they could hear faint echoes at night, the ghosts of bells that had stopped ringing long ago. Governments and councils spoke of progress, of rebuilding, of prosperity waiting just beyond the horizon. But the people who listened heard something else in their words, a hint of desperation, a tremor beneath the promise. Authority had weakened during the long pause, and power, once fractured, was beginning to seek new shape. Behind every public decree, there was uncertainty. Behind every confident voice, a shadow of fear. If your eyelids grow heavier, let them. The story continues even when your thoughts begin to drift. What's coming is not loud, it moves in silence. Just like the dread that once filled those streets. In smaller villages, rumors began to return like old memories. They spoke of sickness in distant towns, of fields failing to grow, of animals behaving strangely. No one knew which stories were true, but truth mattered less than belief. The dread fed on whispers, and whispers were everywhere. Some families began storing food, others packed their belongings quietly, ready to leave if the wind changed. The stillness had taught them one thing: trouble never announces itself twice. The world had learned to fear not the unknown itself, but the waiting before it arrives. That waiting, the long, invisible dread, became the rhythm of life. Bells still rang, clocks still turned, but everyone listened for the silence behind them. That was where the next story always began. As weeks turned to months, the quiet unease deepened. People carried on with their lives, but the movements felt automatic, like echoes of what they once were. Festivals were held again, yet the joy felt forced, the laughter too quick to fade. Even music, that ancient comfort, seemed hollow beneath the weight of memory. When minstrels played in the squares, their songs drifted upward and vanished into the grey sky, unanswered. It was as if the air itself had grown tired of holding sound. Those who lived through the silence knew that stillness could return at any time, and that thought alone made every moment feel temporary. Merchants began to travel less, their caravans moving slower and shorter distances. The trade routes that once connected the world started to shrink. People stayed close to home, preferring the safety of what they knew. In the evenings, when fires burned low, families sat together but rarely spoke. Words felt dangerous, too fragile to trust. The dread wasn't loud, it lived quietly, in the pauses between conversation, in the spaces where laughter once belonged. Even the night sky seemed different, its stars dimmed by an invisible haze. Some said the world was holding its breath again, unsure whether to move forward or hide. If you're still awake, breathe softly. This story moves like the air of those nights, heavy but calm, restless yet quiet. Let it guide your thoughts to stillness. And then came the changes no one could ignore. Small at first, a missing shipment, a broken bridge, a village gone dark. Then came larger ones, rising prices, whispered disappearances, strange gatherings in the city halls. Those who once trusted their leaders began to question their motives. It wasn't rebellion yet, just murmurs beneath the noise. But murmurs, like sparks, have a way of finding the wind. The dread began to shift into something sharper. Suspicion turned to anger, and anger began to take shape. The same people who once feared the silence now feared what might replace it. The balance that held the fragile peace was slipping again, one quiet hour at a time. And somewhere, beyond the villages and towers, a storm was forming, not of wind or rain, but of consequence. A storm built from the memories of stillness, from the weight of silence, from the collective breath of those who had waited too long for the world to feel alive again. The clocks ticked on, unaware of what their rhythm was counting down to. And as night fell across the land once more, the sound of time felt different, again like a warning. A reminder that even after the longest silence, the next noise is never far behind. The night began without warning. It slipped quietly into the world, carried by cold air and distant footsteps. In towns once alive with murmurs, candles flickered in windows like fading memories of light. The streets were almost empty now, lined with the faint smell of rain and smoke. Somewhere, far beyond the city walls, a dog barked once, then stopped. That was how it started, not with a cry, not with a clash, but with stillness. A stillness that felt familiar, the kind that presses against the ribs and makes the heart listen too closely. People didn't yet know what was coming. They only knew that something had shifted again, the way air changes before a storm. The bells didn't ring that evening. The clock towers stood against the deep sky, their hands frozen at uncertain hours. In the absence of sound, even whispers seemed too loud. Doors were barred, windows shuttered, and the smell of burning oil drifted through narrow alleys. It wasn't fear that filled the air, it was memory. The kind of memory that hums under the skin, reminding everyone how silence had once swallowed the world whole. Across the streets, lights went out one by one, as though the night itself was reclaiming what had been borrowed. If you're still awake, listen to the rhythm of the night inside your mind. Every story like this begins softly, as if the world is holding its breath before exhaling something unknown. In the distance, a cart rolled slowly across cobblestone, its wheels squeaking in uneven rhythm. Someone whispered instructions, hurried but calm. Those who still worked under cover of darkness moved with purpose, as if they had rehearsed this moment in their minds 100 times. There was no shouting, no alarmly movement. Quiet, deliberate, coordinated. It was the kind of calm that lives just before chaos, the fragile calm of people who have decided that silence is no longer safety. Inside homes, shadows danced across walls from dying candles. Families stayed still, listening for sounds that never came. Somewhere, a door creaked open, then another. The night was waking, but not in peace. It was awakening to something long restrained: fear, defiance, and the heavy weight of consequence. If your thoughts are slowing down, let them. The story is not rushing anywhere. Like the night it describes, it unfolds in small movements, soft and deliberate. By midnight, the air was thick with tension. The moon hung low, pale against drifting clouds. Those who had waited for this night, whether in anger or duty, were already moving through the shadows. Their footsteps left no sound, their faces unreadable. In the quiet, the world seemed to hold two kinds of time, one that ticked on in the clock towers above, and another that pulsed deep within the human heart. And beneath it all, a truth weighed dense and unspoken. Every silence has its breaking point. Every night, no matter how still, must one day begin. The air carried a strange stillness, one that made every sound feel sharper. Somewhere, a latch clicked, and boots met stone, then another and another. In the distance, the faint glow of torches began to form lines of light weaving through the fog. They moved quietly, the flames bending in the wind like uncertain thoughts. It was not a march, not yet, but a gathering, quiet and precise. Those who saw it from their windows did not speak. They only watched, the same way one watches lightning far away, knowing it will reach them soon enough. The streets were narrow, filled with the smell of wet earth and old smoke. The few who dared to move did so in silence, pressing against walls, blending into shadows. No one knew who to trust anymore. In the darkness, friend and stranger looked the same. Every face was half hidden by fear, and every voice sounded like an echo. It was a night built for secrets, one where truth was quieter than footsteps. If you're still listening, let the sound of your breath match the rhythm of the night. Even in darkness, there is a kind of common, uneasy stillness that asks for patience, not panic. Across the town, old clocks ticked faintly, as if unaware of the world moving beneath them. Their steady rhythm seemed almost mocking. The hands moved, marking time that no one dared to count. Outside, the torches grew brighter, then stopped. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then a sound, a door opening, a voice, sharp and low, giving a name. It carried through the night like a blade drawn slowly from its sheath. Inside the houses, hearts began to race. People held their breath, afraid to move, afraid even to pray aloud. The silence that had once been peace now felt like a trap. It was the same stillness the world had known before, but this time it came with purpose. If your eyelids are heavy, let them close a little. The night here doesn't rush forward. It stretches, unfolds, and waits. The voices outside grew fewer, the movements more certain. In some corners of the city, doors were opened not by force but by fear. Men were taken quietly, their names whispered as if the night itself demanded them. Others hid in basements or behind walls, clutching their breath like fragile glass. The storm had begun not with thunder, but with precision, and yet, if you looked at the sky, it seemed unchanged. The moon still drifted through thin clouds, soft and pale, indifferent to what unfolded below. That is how most storms begin, not loud, but distant. Not with fire, but with silence, learning to move. By dawn, the torches had vanished. The streets were empty again. The air smelled of smoke and damp stone. Windows opened carefully, eyes searching for what remained. But the night had already taken what it came for, and left only echoes behind. The sun rose quietly, touching the rooftops with gold. And though the clocks ticked on as before, their sound felt heavier now. The world had turned again, yes, but it had lost another piece of itself in the dark. If you're drifting now, let the story fade with you. The night began, and so did history's next breath, soft, uncertain, and waiting for morning. When the night finally began to fade, the silence that followed was heavier than the darkness itself. It was not peace, not yet just the hollow space that comes after something has passed. The air was cool and damp, and the streets were washed in the faint grey of early dawn. No one spoke. Even the birds seemed unsure if it was safe to sing. The world held still again, just as it had before, as if time itself paused to remember what had happened in the hours just gone. The houses looked the same from the outside, but something within them had changed. Curtains that once swayed in the wind now stayed shut. Fires burned lower, their embers flickering without warmth. The few who stepped outside did so with careful steps, scanning the empty roads. The scent of smoke lingered in the air, mixed with something colder like fear that refused to leave. The night was over, but its shadow remained. If you're still awake, take a slow breath. The story moves softly now, the way morning light creeps into a quiet room. Nothing hurries here. Even history takes its time to rise. In the corners of the city, the echoes of the night lingered, soft creaks, faint murmurs, the sigh of wind between stone walls. People spoke only in whispers, afraid the night might still be listening. Those who had lost someone said nothing. Those who hadn't kept their gratitude silent. Words felt fragile in the new daylight, as though speech itself could break the calm. By the river, the fog moved like a living thing. It rolled through the streets, swallowing the footprints left from the night before. Fishermen stood at the water's edge, nets in hand, but their eyes were fixed on the horizon instead. They waited for the sun, though none could say why. Maybe because sunlight had become proof that time still moved, that the world still turned. If your thoughts are slowing, let them drift with the mist. Dawn doesn't rush. It listens first. Across the land, bells began to ring again, softly, unevenly, as if uncertain they were allowed to. Each note trembled, echoing across rooftops and valleys, falling like drops of water into still air. The world was waking, but cautiously, like someone recovering from a deep dream. And though no one said it aloud, everyone felt the same question settle inside them. How long before the silence returned? The sky brightened to a pale silver. Smoke rose from chimneys once more, curling lazily upward, thin and uncertain. The people moved slowly, carrying buckets of water, baskets of grain, bits of firewood. They spoke in low tones, voices blending with the sound of morning wind. It was ordinary life, yes, but ordinary had become something rare, something fragile enough to fear losing again. If you can feel your breath steady, stay with it. This moment, the quiet before day, has always been where the world gathers itself again. Far beyond the cities, in open fields and empty roads, the silence stretched wide. It was not empty. It was full of memory. Every shadow held a story, and every breeze carried the ghosts of what had been whispered in the dark. The stillness was not absence, it was a kind of remembering. The earth seemed to exhale at last, as though it too had survived the night. And as the first light touched the rooftops, no one cheered, no one wept. The dawn arrived softly, without grandeur, as if afraid to disturb what little peace remained. The world was still standing, but forever changed. As the morning settled, the world moved as if afraid to make sound. Doors opened quietly, and people stepped into the pale light with slow, uncertain movements. The air was cool, carrying the smell of damp earth and ash. Somewhere, a child began to cry, a small, ordinary sound that broke the spell of stillness. A woman hushed them softly, not in fear, but with a tenderness that the world hadn't felt in a long time. That simple moment of voice, a breath, a whisper felt like proof that life, fragile as it was, had survived the night. In the city's heart, the clock tower began to ring again. Its tone was hesitant, its rhythm uneven, as though time itself were relearning how to move. Each chime carried across the rooftops, echoing through narrow streets and empty courtyards. People stopped to listen, not because they needed to know the hour, but because they needed to know that hours still existed. The sound didn't bring joy, not yet, but it brought something close: continuity. If you're still awake, take another breath. Let it fall into rhythm with the slow turning of time, the same rhythm that guided every sunrise that ever came after silence. Beyond the walls, the countryside stirred with quiet renewal. Farmers touched the soil again, feeling its cold texture between their fingers. The land that had once seemed dead now promised growth. Seeds were planted not just for food, but for faith in life, in the turning of seasons, in the quiet mercy of time's return. Birds began to gather in small groups, uncertain but brave, their wings trembling before the first flight. In homes across towns and villages, people began to speak again. Not loudly, not yet, but with a softness that felt like healing. They spoke of rebuilding, of mending, of remembering. The words carried the weight of all that had been endured and the gentleness of knowing it was finally over, at least for now. No one celebrated. They simply existed together, breathing the same fragile air, letting the morning light find them. If your eyes are growing heavy, let them close. The story is fading, but its rhythm remains the slow hum of a world returning to itself. As the sun climbed higher, the mist began to lift, revealing the outlines of familiar places that looked somehow unfamiliar now. The world was not the same, but it was still here. The quiet between moments had taught humanity something wordless, that time could stop and life could still continue. That even in silence there was motions, low, unseen, but faithful. And when the last of the morning fog drifted away, the towns stood in full light again. People looked up at the sky, and though it held no answers, it felt wide enough to hold all the questions they carried. The dawn had come, not as a triumph, but as a quiet gift. A reminder that even the longest night must someday give way to light. And so, the world moved forward once more cautiously, gently, like a tired traveler taking the first step after a long rest. The silence had not vanished. It had simply changed shape, becoming part of everything that followed. If you've drifted somewhere between thought and sleep, let this story rest with you. The clocks are still turning, the fire is low, and somewhere in the distance, dawn continues to rise softly, endlessly, as it always has. The first bell rang on a quiet morning, long after the fog had lifted. Its sound was faint, almost fragile, carried by a wind that had forgotten what echoes felt like. People paused where they stood, hands still, breath caught. The note hung in the air for a moment longer than it should have, trembling with memory. For months, maybe years, no one had heard such a sound. It wasn't just metal striking metal, which was life reminding the world that time still wanted to move. One by one, other bells began to follow. Not all at once, not in harmony, but unevenly, like a conversation between distant towns learning to speak again. Some tones were deep and worn, others sharp and new. They drifted over fields and rivers, through the bones of broken cities, and into quiet homes. And for the first time, in what felt like forever, people stopped listening for danger. They listened for rhythm. If you're still awake, imagine that sound, the soft hum of bells crossing a sleeping landscape. It doesn't demand attention. It just lingers, like comfort spreading slowly through cold air. In the villages, old clock towers that had stood still for years began to stir again. Rusted gears creaked, ropes tightened, and dust fell from their arches like snow. The men who climbed the towers to restore them worked in silence, as though afraid to disturb what they were reviving. When the first restored clock began to tick again, the sound filled the tower's hollow chamber, heartbeat rediscovered. Across the land, people came out to listen. Some smiled faintly, others wept quietly, unsure why. It wasn't joy alone, it was recognition. The bells didn't just mark time, they marked survival. Each chime was a small victory, a signal that humanity had not vanished inside the silence after all. If your breathing has softened, let it stay that way. The story's rhythm now mirrors the bell's steady, slow, and full of space between each sound. Children who had grown up in the quiet stopped playing when the bells rang. They looked to their parents, curious, confused, and almost afraid. For them, time had never been marked by sound. To hear it again was like meeting a stranger everyone else already knew. Slowly, they began to smile. The sound became familiar, comforting, like the world was humming them to sleep. The bells carried across valleys where grass had grown over forgotten roads. They reached forests where no one had walked in years. Animals lifted their heads, listening, as if nature itself was remembering what the sound of human rhythm meant. The bells didn't belong to any one place anymore. They belonged to everyone who had waited through the silence. If you close your eyes now, you can almost hear them, too, the low, rolling tones that drift through space and memory. They carry warmth without words, a quiet assurance that life, even after stopping, can begin again. In the heart of one city, a great bell rang above a square that had once been empty. People gathered beneath it, standing in the same silence that had once defined their fear. But this silence was different. It was the kind that comes after peace, not before danger. When the final chime faded into the sky, no one spoke. They simply listened to the space it left behind, the pure, simple sound of time breathing once more. As the days passed, the bells became part of life again. They marked the morning, the evening, and the quiet space between. People began to measure their routines by sound once more, the ring that called workers to the fields, the softer chime that told them it was time to rest. But now, Each note carried meaning beyond habit. The bells were no longer just reminders of time, they were symbols of endurance. Each sound said, "You are still here." In small towns, new bells were cast from melted metal salvaged after the silence. The workers who shaped them did so with quiet pride, knowing that their craft was rebuilding more than tools, it was restoring rhythm. When those new bells first rang, they didn't sound perfect. They were rough, uneven, sometimes even off-key. But to the people who heard them, they were beautiful. Because imperfection, after all, meant life. If you're still listening, feel how the rhythm slows again, like the world itself, learning to breathe evenly for the first time in years. Travelers wrote about how the bells could be heard from miles away, rolling across meadows, echoing through forests, blending with the wind. In some places, the sound arrived before the sunrise, floating through open windows to wake people gently from their dreams. The world was still recovering, but those echoes became a promise. Time would not fall silent again, not so easily. In the cities, the bells grew louder. Some rang with ceremony, others with quiet purpose. They marked the return of trade, of laughter, of festivals. But even in celebration, there was restraint. People remembered what it felt like to lose the sound of time, and they held onto it carefully, as though afraid it might vanish once more. If your eyes are growing heavy, let them. The bells that once woke the world now ring softly in memory. Their rhythm is steady, their echo slow. There were those who never trusted the sound again. For them, the bells were a reminder of everything that came before the stillness, the waiting, the fear. They said time should not be trusted, that it could stop again whenever it wished. But most people chose to believe in it anyway, because belief, like time, is what keeps the world moving. And so, the bells continued to ring day after day, year after year. They became the pulse of a healing world, each note weaving a fragile thread between past and present. Children grew up with their music, never knowing a world without it. The silence had become a story, a memory whispered on quiet nights. If you can hear the rhythm of your own breathing now, that's all this story ever wanted to bring you into the same calm the bells once gave to those who survived. At dusk, when the sky turned gold and the light stretched across rooftops, the bells rang one final time for the day. People stopped again, as they always did, to listen. The echoes traveled through streets, across rivers, into forests and mountains. And when the last note faded, the silence that followed was no longer empty, it was peace. The world had found its sound again, not as it was before, but softer, wiser, and infinitely more precious. And somewhere, in that endless echo, time smiled quietly, and went on turning. The world did not rush back to life. It moved slowly, like a river thawing after winter, hesitant, gentle, unsure. The bells had awakened time, but time itself seemed careful now, as if afraid to move too fast and break the quiet that had healed so much. The air felt different, lighter, yet still marked by memory. People no longer spoke of what had happened, not because they had forgotten, but because silence had become a kind of respect. The stillness was no longer something to fear. It was something they had learned to live beside. In the mornings, smoke rose once again from chimneys. Markets opened earlier, though the noise was softer than before. Merchants greeted each other with nods instead of shouts. The world had remembered how to move, but not how to hurry. Every gesture carried weight. Every sound felt deliberate. After so much stillness, even a footstep seemed like an act of courage. Life had returned, but it walked gently. If you're still awake, Notice the way the rhythm slows again here. The story breathes deeply, just as the world did when it first found calm after chaos. The fields began to bloom again. Flowers, once left untended, grew wildly along the edges of stone paths. Birds sang from rooftops, their melodies uncertain but bright. Farmers returned to the rhythm of the earth, planting, harvesting, resting. Yet everything they did felt different now. They no longer worked against time, they worked with it. The pause had taught them that nothing truly belongs to haste. In the cities, repairs continued quietly. Stones were lifted, beams replaced, and streets cleared of debris. But there was no sense of rush. The memory of loss had stripped the world of its former arrogance. Progress had become patience. Builders stopped to rest more often. Neighbors offered help without asking. For once, creation was not born from ambition, but from gratitude. If your breathing has softened, keep it steady. The story, like the morning, unfolds at its own pace. Children born after the silence grew up listening to the bells. To them, time had always existed. It was their parents who looked up whenever the chimes sounded, eyes distant and still. They told stories about the time when the clocks stopped, when the air itself seemed to forget how to move. The children would listen wide-eyed, unable to imagine a world without sound. To them, silence was only a bedtime tale. In quiet homes, families began to gather again for evening meals. Bread was passed from hand to hand, and laughter began to return, soft, careful laughter, as if testing its strength. No one took it for granted. They ate slowly, talked quietly, and stayed awake a little longer than before, unwilling to waste the hours they had regained. If your eyes are growing heavier, that's all right. This part of the story was meant to feel like dusks, slow, warm, and safe. Across distant lands, travelers returned to the roads. They carried stories more than goods, sharing them from town to town like embers of memory. Each tale was different, yet somehow all the same. Stories of loss, of endurance, of the strange beauty that had come when time stopped. And though people listened with sadness, they also listened with calm. The stories no longer hurt, they simply reminded. The world was not trying to forget. It was learning how to remember softly. As the years quietly unfolded, the world began to find its rhythm again. The clocks kept steady time now, their ticking no longer haunting but gentle like the heartbeat of a world learning to trust itself. People began to smile more easily. They rebuilt not just homes, but rituals. The first day of spring was celebrated again, not with grand parades, but with flowers laid on doorsteps, soft music, and shared bread. It was enough. The world had learned that peace did not need to be loud to be real. The bells still rang each morning, their sound blending with the rustle of leaves and the faint call of distant birds. It was no longer a sound of survival, it was gratitude. Farmers greeted the dawn with calm purpose. Children played in the streets, their laughter filling the spaces where silence had once lived. Even the sky seemed kinder, softer, painted with light that felt slower somehow, as if time itself had decided to walk beside them instead of ahead. If you're still listening, take a deep breath. You're hearing the same quiet rhythm the world once rediscovered, gentle, balanced, unhurried. In the evenings, people gathered outside their homes again. They told stories under the fading light, voices weaving through the cool air. No one spoke about the plague anymore, but it was there, in every pause, in every shared glance. It had become part of them, woven into their patience, their humility, their care. What once brought fear now brought understanding. The stillness had not just taken, it had taught. Trade returned. but it moved differently. Merchants traveled not for greed, but for connection. Towns began to share, to depend on one another, slowly mending what distance had broken. Coins passed between hands again, but the gesture carried meaning beyond commerce. It was trust rebuilt in small, steady increments. If your breathing is soft now, let it stay so. This part of the story is meant to settle you, the way the earth settles after long rain. Art returned to, but it was simpler. Painters captured light falling through windows, the curve of a smile, the way wind brushed through tall grass. Writers described the sound of footsteps on morning roads. Even the songs that filled the air were slower, deeper. The world had learned to find beauty in stillness, and in doing so, discovered something timeless about peace. As time moved forward, the silence became a memory told by grandparents to their grandchildren, half history, half lullaby. There was a time, they would say, when the world forgot to move. The children would laugh, not in disbelief, but in wonder, unable to imagine such stillness. And yet, they would listen until sleep took them, lulled by the rhythm of voices shaped by memory. When the bells rang at dusk, their sound was no longer an ending, but a blessing. Each echo drifted through the air and lingered, folding the day gently into night. People stopped for a moment to listen, not out of fear, not out of duty, but out of quiet love for the sound of time itself. And somewhere, beneath it all, the world exhaled the long breath it had held since the silence first began. Life had returned, not as it was before, but softer, wiser, and closer to what it was always meant to be. If your eyes are closing now, let them. The story of time is still unfolding, but for tonight, it's enough to rest in the peace it finally learned to keep. Time had started to move again, but it no longer hurried. It had learned patience from silence, softness from loss, and meaning from every breath that dared to continue. The world turned with quiet dignity now, its pulse steady, its days full of small, ordinary beauty. Clocks still ticked, bells still rang, but they sounded different, warmer, more human. It was as though time itself had remembered those who had lived through the pause, and out of mercy, slowed its pace to walk beside them. In the early mornings, the sound of life returned in layers. A door creaking open, a broom brushing stone, a faint hum of song escaping from a window. None of it felt rushed. Each sound carried the weight of remembrance, of what had once been nearly lost. People had stopped measuring time by minutes and hours. They measured it instead by light, by laughter, by the spaces between their breaths. If you're still awake, breathe with that rhythm. Slow.com, uncounted. This story, like time itself, isn't meant to be measured, only felt. In cities that had once been filled with fear, the rhythm of footsteps returned. Streets echoed softly again, not with chaos, but with presence. People walked slower, noticing things they had once ignored. The way morning light pooled on stone walls, how dust floated like tiny stars in the sun. They had lived through a silence so deep that even sound felt sacred now. Villagers rebuilt their gathering places. Long tables were repaired, benches smoothed by careful hands. At dusk, families and neighbors came together not for ceremony, but for company. No one felt the need to fill the air with talk. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was full of understanding. If your thoughts are floating, let them. The world in this story floats too, between the memory of silence and the comfort of motion. Some historians would later call this time the Gentle Age. They wrote that the years following the Great Stillness were the calmest in memory, not because there was no hardship, but because people had learned how to face it quietly. Patience had become a kind of wisdom, and stillness a kind of strength. The bells no longer commanded people's days. They accompanied them. Their sound marked not control, but continuity. Every chime felt like a promise that even if the world stopped again someday, time would find its way back, as it always did. If your eyes are heavy, let them close halfway. The story moves slowly now, the way the earth turns beneath stars, steady, unseen, but certain. In faraway fields, travelers spoke of how sunsets looked longer than before, as though the sun itself had learned to linger, and maybe it had. Maybe even light, in its endless journey, paused out of respect for all that the world had endured. It was in those moments when the day refused to end too quickly that people felt closest to something greater than themselves. The stillness had once frightened them. Now it comforted them. It reminded them that peace was not the absence of sound, but the space that allows sound to exist. That time itself was not a master to serve, but a companion to share. As the years unfolded, time moved gently, unafraid to rest. People no longer chased it. They walked alongside it, grateful simply to exist within its rhythm. The world had learned something precious, that life did not need to be loud to be meaningful, nor constant to be real. It was enough to wake, to work, to share, to rest. The silence that once haunted them had become a quiet companion. Even in still moments, they no longer feared the absence of sound. They understood now that stillness, too, was alive. Artists painted slower scenes, windows filled with soft light, hands holding cups of tea, landscapes that seemed to breathe. Writers described silence not as emptiness, but as grace. And in those words and colors, humanity recorded what could not be forgotten, the moment the world had stopped, and the miracle of how it began again. Time, it seemed, had forgiven them. If you're still awake, let the rhythm settle around you. The story has become like a lullabystudy.com, unhurried. When the bells rang now, they sounded less like commands and more like memories. They reminded people that every moment, however brief, was a gift borrowed from something larger. The world no longer tried to control, Tamit listened to it, and time, in turn, seemed to listen back. Each sunrise, each echo, each pause felt shared. There was no rush to finish the day, no urgency to measure what could simply be lived. Villages thrived again. Cities found balance. The same streets that had once been empty now filled with laughter and footsteps that echoed without fear. And though the shadow of the great stillness lingered in memory, it no longer weighed heavy. It had become a teacher, its lesson written softly in the rhythm of daily life. If your breathing has grown slow and peaceful, stay there. You're in the same quiet place this story came from, the space between night and dawn, between memory and hope. In the final years of that age, old clock towers stood tall once more. Their bells rang across generations that had never known silence. And still, each time they did, the world paused not out of fear, but out of respect. Time had remembered them. It had stopped once, yes, but it had come back, kind, patient, forgiving. Humanity had learned not to take its return for granted. The story of that stillness would be told for centuries, not as tragedy, but as wisdom, a reminder that when everything stops, it doesn't mean the end. Sometimes, it simply means the world is waiting to begin again. And as night fell once more, with bells ringing softly in the distance, the world rested not because it was tired, but because it finally could. If you've enjoyed this quiet journey through history, I invite you to subscribe and return next time. There's always another forgotten story waiting for you. Next time, we'll wander into the fragile, tense years of the modern world when silence was replaced by the hum of machines and fear took a new shape in the shadow of power. A time when humanity stood at the edge and asked itself a single question: why did the Cold War almost end civilization? Until then, rest well. Let history keep watch while you sleep. Time will remember you, too.